The massive chamber of the Galactic Council stretched out like a metal cathedral, its walls gleaming under the cold blue light of artificial stars. Hundreds of alien species filled the circular seating arrangement, their voices creating a constant hum of clicks, whistles, and strange sounds that the translation devices worked hard to convert into understandable speech. At the center of it all sat the human delegation, 3 figures in simple dark suits that looked almost plain, compared to the elaborate clothing and natural decorations of the aliens around. The Ambassador Daniel Hayes sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him, his jaw tight as he listened to yet another council member explain why Earth needed to surrender its independence. His gray hair was cut short and neat, and his blue eyes had lost their patience somewhere around hour 6 of this meeting. Behind him stood Commander Lisa Grant, a woman in her early 40s with sharp features and a military posture that never relaxed. To his right sat Captain Jake Morrison, younger than both of them, with the kind of calm expression that came from years of training to stay cool under pressure. The current speaker was Counselor Vexthar, a creature that looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a suit of armor. His voice came out in rapid clicks that the translator turned into precise cold words. He was explaining for the third time why humanity needed to place all military vessels under Council command and why Earth's defensive systems represented a threat to Galactic's peace. Daniel had heard it all before. 3 years of this. 3 years of sitting in this chamber while aliens who had never set foot on Earth told him how humans should live, how they should defend themselves, and how they should simply trust that species who had been fighting wars for thousands of years would suddenly protect humanity out of pure goodness. The proposal on the table was simple in its audacity. Earth would dismantle its orbital defense platforms, reduce its fleet to 1/10 of its current size, and allow Council inspectors unlimited access to all human military facilities and research stations. In exchange, the Council would provide protection and allow Earth to continue trading under Council supervision. Daniel glanced at Lisa, who gave him the smallest shake of her head. They had discussed this scenario a dozen times. Earth Command had been clear in their instructions. No surrender of sovereignty, no external control of human defense, no compromise on independence. He looked at Jake, who met his eyes and nodded once. The captain's hand rested near his sidearm, not as a threat but as a reminder that humans came to this place prepared for anything. Vexthar finished his speech and sat down with a clicking sound that might have been satisfaction. High Arbiter Quellon rose next, his crystalline body catching the light and splitting it into rainbow patterns across the chamber floor. He was the leader of the Council, an ancient being whose species had been exploring space when humans were still learning to make fire. His voice resonated through the chamber without need for translation, a sound that seemed to bypass ears and speak directly to the mind. It was meant to be impressive and authoritative. It probably worked on most species. Quellon spoke about unity and cooperation, about how all species must sacrifice for the greater good, about how Earth's resistance to these simple requests showed a lack of maturity and understanding. He spoke about the dangers of allowing any single species to maintain independent military power. He spoke about the wisdom of the Council and its thousands of years of experience in maintaining peace. What he did not speak about was why this peace required wars every few decades. He did not mention the species that had been forcibly integrated into the Council. He did not talk about the rebellion that had been crushed in the Outer Territories just 5 years ago. Daniel let him talk. He had learned that interrupting a Council speech only made things take longer. Instead, he pulled up his data pad and scrolled through the latest reports from Earth. The numbers told an interesting story, one that the Council seemed determined to ignore. Earth's mining operations in the asteroid belt were producing 40% of the high-grade metals that the Council used in ship construction. Human agricultural technology was feeding 17 worlds that had exhausted their own soil. The quantum processors that ran most Council computers came from labs in Seattle and Mumbai. The junction routes, the 3 main corridors that connected the inner and outer territories of Council space, were guarded by human defense stations. Somewhere along the way, while the Council had been busy debating and making demands, humanity had become essential. The aliens seemed to think that Earth needed the Council to survive. They had not stopped to consider whether the Council could survive without Earth. Quellon finished his speech and looked directly at Daniel. The crystalline being's form pulsed with a light that the translator said indicated expectation and authority. He was waiting for Daniel to respond, to negotiate, to try once more to find some compromise that would satisfy the council's demands while saving some scrap of human dignity. Daniel stood up slowly. The chamber grew quiet as hundreds of alien eyes and eye equivalents turned toward him. He could feel the weight of their attention, the assumption that he would bend, that he would find some way to make this work. He looked at Kelon and then let his gaze sweep across the entire chamber, taking in all the species that had spent 3 years telling humanity what to do. When he spoke, his voice was calm and clear. The words came out steady and final, with no room for misunderstanding or negotiation. He told them that humanity was done with these meetings. He said that Earth had tried diplomacy and had made reasonable offers and had bent over backward to find solutions. He explained that the Council had rejected everything except complete human surrender. He stated that no free species would accept the terms being demanded. Then he said the words that would change everything. He announced that Earth was withdrawing from all Council proceedings immediately. He declared that humanity would handle its own affairs from this moment forward. He made it clear that this was not a negotiating tactic or a temporary stance. This was the end of human participation in the Galactic Council. The chamber erupted in noise. Aliens stood and shouted in their various languages. The translators struggled to keep up with the chaos. Quelon's crystalline form flashed bright red, a color that indicated shock and anger. Vexthar was on his feet, mandibles clicking so fast that the translator gave up and just produced a screeching sound. Other counselors demanded that Daniel sit down, that he reconsider, that he understand the consequences of what he was saying. Daniel ignored them all. He gathered his datapad and nodded to Lisa and Jake. The 3 humans walked toward the chamber doors with steady steps, not rushing but not hesitating either. Behind them, Quelon was speaking again, his mental voice trying to cut through the chaos. He was saying something about consequences and about how Earth could not stand alone, and about how the Council had authority over all member species. Daniel stopped at the doors and turned back one last time. He looked at Quelon and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. He said that maybe the Council would finally learn what happened when they cornered a species that had spent its entire existence fighting to survive. He said that if the Council wanted to find out what humans were capable of when pushed too far, they were welcome to try. Then he walked out, and the massive doors sealed behind the human delegation with a sound like thunder. The doors had barely closed behind the human delegation when the Galactic Council chamber descended into complete chaos. Counselors were shouting over each other in dozens of languages, while the translation system struggled to keep up with the overwhelming noise. Some aliens were standing on their seats while others were gesturing wildly with whatever appendages their species possessed. The orderly meeting had transformed into something closer to a riot in the span of 30 seconds. High Arbiter Quelon stood at the center platform with his crystalline form flashing through, colors faster than most species could process, red for anger, blue for confusion, yellow for alarm, and back to red again. His mental voice tried to cut through the noise, but even his authority could not restore order immediately. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in, and panic was spreading like fire through dry grass. Counselor Vexithar was clicking so rapidly that his mandibles were becoming a blur. He was demanding that someone go after the humans and bring them back by force if necessary. Several other counselors were agreeing with him, while others were calling for sanctions or blockades or immediate military action. A few of the quieter species representatives were already pulling up data on their screens with expressions that suggested they understood, something the louder voices did not. Quelon finally managed to restore some semblance of order by amplifying his mental voice to a level that made every being in the chamber stop and clutch their heads. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of his next words echoing directly into every mind present. He told them to sit down and be quiet and think before they spoke. He said that they needed information before they could make any decisions about how to respond to Earth's withdrawal. Counselor Zaraneth from the Serene Accord was one of the first to speak once the chamber had settled. She was a tall being with skin that shifted between blue and green depending on her emotional state. And right now she was showing a deep purple that indicated serious concern. She asked the question that several others had been thinking but had not yet voiced. She wanted to know exactly how much the council depended on human trade and services. The request was directed at the council's economic division, and specifically at a young analyst named Trevcore. He was a Zentari, a species known for their attention to detail and their ability to process large amounts of information quickly. Trevcore had been assigned to monitor human activities 3 years ago, when Earth first joined the council proceedings. Unlike most of his superiors, he had actually read all the reports and analyzed all the data, instead of just skimming the summaries. His claws trembled slightly as he pulled up the files on the main display screen. The numbers appeared in the air above the chamber floor where everyone could see them clearly. The first chart showed Earth's contribution to council military resources, and the percentage was so high that several councilors made sounds of disbelief. Trevcore explained in a quiet voice that 40% of all military-grade alloys used in council ship construction came from human mining operations in their asteroid belt. The humans had developed extraction techniques that allowed them to work in debris fields that other species considered too dangerous or too expensive to bother with. They had then sold these materials to the council at fair prices for the past decade. The next chart showed something even more concerning. 65% of advanced computing systems used throughout council space relied on quantum processors designed and manufactured by humans. These processors were smaller, faster, and more efficient than anything other species had developed. They ran everything from ship navigation systems to planetary defense networks to the very translation devices that allowed different species to communicate. But the chart that caused the most alarm showed agricultural exports. Earth's farming technology had revolutionized food production, allowing crops to grow in conditions that would normally be impossible. 17 council worlds that had depleted their own agricultural resources were now dependent on human food shipments. Without those shipments, those worlds would face serious shortages within weeks. Vexthar tried to dismiss the numbers as exaggerated, but Trevcore stood his ground. The young analyst pointed out that every piece of data came from the council's own trade records. These were not estimates or projections. These were actual transactions that had been happening for years while everyone was too busy making demands to notice what they were demanding from. Another counselor asked about the junction routes. These were the 3 main corridors that connected the inner territories of council space with the outer colonies. They were essential for trade and travel and military movement. The question was whether humans really controlled them or if that was just an exaggeration. Fleet Admiral Corveth rose to answer. He was a massive being from a species bred for war, with thick armor plating and multiple arms that could operate weapons with frightening efficiency. His species had been the backbone of council military power for centuries. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood strategic reality better than politicians ever could. He confirmed that humanity did indeed control the junction routes, not through conquest or force but through construction and maintenance. 20 years ago, before Earth joined the council proceedings, the junction routes had been plagued by piracy and mechanical failures. Human defense stations had ended the piracy problem within 2 years. Human engineering teams had built the relay stations that now kept the routes functioning smoothly. If those defense stations stopped allowing council ships to pass through, 70% of council commerce would be forced to use longer alternative routes. Trips that currently took days would take weeks. Supply chains would collapse. Military response times would be cut in half. The entire infrastructure of council space depended on those 3 corridors remaining open. Corveth pulled up tactical maps that showed the defensive capabilities of those stations. They were not massive weapons platforms designed to project power. They were efficient, practical defensive installations designed to protect the routes and nothing more. But they were positioned perfectly to control access, and they were armed well enough to hold off anything short of a full fleet assault. The Admiral pointed out something else that made several counselors shift uncomfortably in their seats. A full fleet assault on those stations would take months to organize and would certainly result in heavy casualties. It would also destroy the very infrastructure the council needed to keep functioning. Attacking the humans would be like burning down your own house because you were angry at the builder. Quellen's crystalline form had settled into a dim gray color that indicated deep thought and growing dread. He asked about the council's military capabilities without human support. The question was directed at Corveth, who clearly did not want to answer it. The Admiral explained that approximately 20% of the Council fleet used components manufactured by human contractors. Spare parts were available for perhaps 6 months under normal operating conditions. In combat situations, maybe half that time. Furthermore, 3 of the Council's 5 major shipyards had been operated by human technical staff. Those facilities had stopped production the moment the humans walked out of the chamber. A counselor from the rear section stood up and demanded to know how this had happened. She wanted to know how a single species that had only been in space for 2 centuries could have become so deeply integrated into Council operations. She accused the Economic Division of incompetence and demanded someone take responsibility for this disaster. Trevcore responded before his superiors could silence him. He said that this had not happened by accident or through incompetence. It had happened because humans were good at what they did. They were efficient and innovative and willing to take on jobs that other species considered beneath them or too difficult. They had not forced anyone to buy their products or use their services. The Council had chosen to do business with Earth because it made economic sense. He added something else that made the chamber fall silent again. He said that the Council had been treating humanity like children who needed guidance and control. Everyone had assumed that Earth needed the Council more than the Council needed Earth. They had forgotten to consider that the young species they were trying to manage had spent 2 centuries building and trading and making themselves useful. They had forgotten that humans did not ask for permission before they solved problems. Quellon finally spoke again, and his mental voice was subdued. He asked what would happen if they tried to force Earth back to the negotiating table. Several counselors immediately began suggesting military options ranging from blockades to targeted strikes on Earth's orbital facilities. Korveth cut them off with a gesture that could have been polite or could have been a threat, depending on interpretation. He said that any military action against Earth would be a mistake of catastrophic proportions. The humans had built their defense systems with the assumption that they might have to fight off an invasion from a superior force. Their planetary defense grid was designed to make any assault so costly that no rational enemy would attempt it. He pulled up the intelligence reports that Council military analysts had compiled on human defensive capabilities. The numbers painted a picture of a species that had learned warfare through thousands of years of constant conflict. Human ships were smaller than Council vessels, but they were faster and more maneuverable. Human tactics emphasized overwhelming force and rapid response. Human crews trained for combat scenarios that other species considered unnecessarily brutal. More importantly, humans had a psychological profile that made them dangerous opponents. They did not surrender easily. They did not break under pressure. They had a cultural tendency to become more determined when threatened. Every war in human history had demonstrated that cornering them only made them fight harder. The chamber was quiet now as the reality settled over everyone present. Earth had not stormed out in a moment of emotion. The withdrawal had been calculated and prepared. The humans had known exactly what they were doing, and they had done it with the confidence of a species that believed it could survive whatever came next. Quellon dimmed to almost complete darkness. He said they needed to contact Ambassador Daniel Hayes and request new negotiations. Someone asked what terms they could possibly offer that would bring the humans back. The High Arbiter responded with words that no one in the chamber had expected to hear. He said they would offer whatever it took. The bridge of the EDS horizon was quiet except for the steady hum of systems and the occasional beep from monitoring stations. Admiral Kate Fletcher stood near the center command chair with her arms crossed, watching the main display screen as data streamed in from Earth Command. She was a woman in her late 50s with iron-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that had seen enough of space to know when something important was about to happen. She had been expecting this moment for months and had spent that time making sure her fleet was ready. The message from Earth Command came through on the secure channel, and Kate read it twice before nodding to herself. The orders were clear and direct, with no room for interpretation or hesitation. All trade with Council worlds was to be suspended immediately. All Earth vessels operating in Council space were to return to human-controlled territory as quickly as possible. Any alien ships attempting to enter human space without proper clearance were to be turned away using whatever force was necessary. She turned to her communications officer and told him to transmit the orders to every human ship in the sector. Lieutenant Chris Palmer was young but competent. with steady hands and the kind of calm voice that stayed level even during emergencies. He sent out the message and then looked up at Kate with an expression that mixed excitement with concern. Within minutes, responses started coming back. Cargo haulers acknowledged the orders and changed course toward home. Mining ships began shutting down operations in the asteroid fields. Research vessels stopped their studies and started calculating jump routes back to Earth. Defense stations went to full alert and locked down their sectors. The entire human presence in this part of space was pulling back like a wave retreating before a storm. Chris reported that they were receiving distress calls from 3 council worlds. The planets had been expecting food shipments that were now not coming. Local authorities were asking when the next Earth transport would arrive, and whether there had been some kind of scheduling error. Their messages had the tone of people who assumed this was a temporary problem that could be fixed with a few communications. Kate told Chris to respond to each message with the same statement. She said to tell them that Earth no longer provided services to hostile governments and that they should contact the Galactic Council for assistance. Her voice was flat and professional as she gave the order, but there was something underneath it that might have been satisfaction. The speed of Earth's withdrawal was impressive even to the people organizing it. Human traders who had been operating in council space for years closed their shops and packed their equipment within hours. Mining operations that had taken months to establish were abandoned or transferred to human-controlled asteroids. Technical support staff working on alien stations submitted their resignations and booked passage home. Support workers who maintained critical infrastructure simply stopped. Showing up for their shifts, the council had assumed that humans would be reluctant to leave the trading opportunities and established positions they had built over years of work. What the aliens failed to understand was that humans were very good at walking away from things when their principles were at stake. They had done it throughout their history, abandoning cities and fortunes and comfortable lives when those things came at the cost of their freedom. Back on Earth, the reaction to the council withdrawal was not fear or panic, but something closer to relief mixed with defiance. President Helen Carter stood before the Solar Congress in Geneva to address the representatives of Earth's unified government. She was a tall woman with dark skin and gray streaks in her hair, someone who had come up through planetary governance before taking on the larger role. She spoke with the kind of authority that came from knowing she had the full support of her people. She explained that the council had been given 30 months to negotiate in good faith. They had been offered reasonable compromises and opportunities for partnership. Instead, they had issued ultimatums and demanded surrender. She stated that Earth chose to stand alone as it always had, and that humanity would not trade its freedom for the illusion of security provided by people who could not even maintain peace among themselves. The Congress erupted in applause that lasted for several minutes. Representatives from the Mars colonies and the Jupiter stations and the outer settlements all stood to show their support. These were people whose ancestors had risked everything to settle new worlds. The idea of surrendering the independence they had fought for to aliens who treated them like children was offensive on a level that transcended practical concerns, but Earth was not simply withdrawing and hoping for the best. The government had been planning for this possibility since the Council first started making unreasonable demands. Dr. Nathan Cole stood before a committee of scientists and military advisors in a secure facility beneath the surface of Luna. He was a thin man with messy, brown hair and the kind of intense focus that came from spending years studying alien civilizations. Nathan explained that Earth had been quietly making contact with 6 non-council species over the past year. These were smaller civilizations that the major powers largely ignored. They had their own reasons for staying independent of the Council, and they had been watching Earth's situation with great interest. Now they were ready to discuss trade agreements and mutual defense pacts and technology exchanges. One of the committee members asked what Earth could offer these species that the Council could not. Nathan smiled and pulled up a presentation that showed human technology side by side with Council equivalents. In almost every category, human designs were more efficient, more compact, or more adaptable. Humans had entered space later than most species, but they had done so without outside help, which meant they had developed solutions to problems that other species had never needed to solve. He explained that Earth was offering these smaller civilizations fair trade terms with no strings attached. No demands for military integration. No requirements to adopt human government systems. No insistence on cultural changes. Just honest business between independent peoples who respected each other's sovereignty. It was the kind of relationship Earth had wanted with the Council but had never been offered. The committee asked about protection. If these smaller species agreed to work with Earth, they would become targets for Council pressure or possibly even military action. What could humanity offer that would make the risk worthwhile? Nathan's smile faded and his expression became serious. He said that Earth would extend the same protection to its trading partners that it provided to its own colonies. Any attack on these species would be treated as an attack on human interests. He pulled up tactical data showing the deployment of Earth's military forces and the defensive capabilities that had been built up over decades of cautious preparation. The committee members studied the numbers in silence. Earth's fleet was not the largest in known space, but it was modern and well-maintained, and crewed by people who trained constantly for combat scenarios. The planetary defense grid could hold off an invasion force many times larger than anything the Council was likely to commit. The network of defense stations scattered through human space created a perimeter that would cost any attacker dearly to breach. More importantly, Earth had something that the Council lacked: unity of purpose. Every human from the home world to the furthest colony understood that their independence was not negotiable. They would fight to defend it not because they wanted war, but because they refused to live under someone else's control. That kind of determination was worth more than superior numbers or bigger ships. Nathan explained that 2 of the 6 species had already signed preliminary agreements. 3 more were in final negotiations. The last one was still considering the offer, but seemed likely to accept. Within a few months, Earth would have a network of trading partners and allies that operated completely outside Council control. It would be the foundation of an alternative power structure in the galaxy. One committee member asked what the Council's reaction would be when they realized what Earth was doing. Nathan's response was simple. He said the Council would either accept the new reality, or they would try to stop it. If they chose the second option, they would learn exactly how capable humans were when defending something they believed in. Back on the horizon, Kate received a priority message from Earth Command. The Council was already trying to make contact. They wanted to discuss resuming negotiations. They were suggesting that perhaps some of their previous demands had been excessive. They were using diplomatic language to say that they were ready to talk about compromises. Kate read the message and then deleted it. Earth had spent 30 months trying to negotiate with people who only understood power. Now the Council was learning what it felt like to be on the other side of that equation. They could wait a while longer before Earth decided whether their request for talks deserved a response. She looked at the main screen showing the positions of human ships as they moved through space toward home. Every vessel was exactly where it was supposed to be. Every crew was following orders without hesitation. The withdrawal was proceeding like a military operation because that was exactly what it was. Chris reported that more distress calls were coming in from Council worlds. Food shortages were developing faster than the aliens had expected. Some mining operations had discovered that without human technical support, their equipment was breaking down. A few stations were reporting system failures that their own engineers could not fix. Kate told him to log the messages, but not to respond. Earth was not being cruel or vindictive. They were not helping anymore. There was a difference that the Council needed to understand. Humanity had never asked to be essential to galactic infrastructure. The aliens had made that choice by consistently choosing to buy human services because they were better and cheaper than the alternatives. Now they would learn what it cost to take those services for granted. Now they would understand that partnership required respect, and now they would discover whether they could survive without the species they had tried so hard to control. Kate looked out at the stars and allowed herself a small smile. Humanity had come to space hoping to find friends and partners. Instead, they had found people who wanted subjects. The Council was about to learn that humans did not make good subjects. They made much better enemies. 3 weeks had passed since Earth walked away from the Galactic Council, and the situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had predicted. The council chamber that had once been filled with confident voices and grand declarations now echoed with desperate arguments and accusations. High Arbiter Quellen stood at the center platform, trying to maintain order while counselors shouted over each other in a chaos that would have been Unthinkable just a month ago, Counselor Mirasol from Agricultural Affairs was presenting the latest reports, and her voice carried the strain of someone delivering bad news repeatedly. She explained that 7 colony worlds were now experiencing serious food shortages. The populations were not starving yet, but supplies were running low and panic buying had begun. 2 mining operations in the outer territories had completely shut down because critical equipment had failed, and the human technicians who knew how to repair it were gone. The junction routes were still blocked by human defense. Stations and ships were being forced to take alternative paths that added weeks to every journey. She pulled up economic projections that showed the cascading effects of Earth's withdrawal. Transportation costs had increased by 40% because of the longer routes. Delivery times had doubled or tripled for essential goods. Prices were rising across council space as shortages developed, and suppliers struggled to meet demand through less efficient channels. Several worlds were reporting civil unrest as their populations realized that the conveniences they had taken for granted were disappearing. Vexthar was on his feet again, demanding military action. His mandibles clicked with agitation as he argued that the council could not allow a single species to hold them hostage. He proposed sending a fleet to blockade Earth's system and force the humans back to negotiations through economic pressure. Several other counselors voiced their agreement with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Fleet Admiral Korveth rose slowly from his seat, and the chamber quieted. The massive warrior had a presence that commanded attention even among beings who considered themselves powerful. His voice was calm but carried an underlying warning that made several counselors shift uncomfortably. He began by addressing the military realities that everyone seemed determined to ignore. The council fleet currently had spare parts for approximately 20 weeks of normal operations. In combat conditions, that number dropped to perhaps 10 weeks. 3 major shipyards were still offline because the human contractors who operated them had left. New ship construction had effectively stopped. The fleet they had today was the fleet they would have for months to come, with no way to replace losses or repair significant damage. Korveth pulled up tactical assessments of Earth's defensive capabilities. The planetary defense grid consisted of orbital platforms, ground-based weapons, and a network of satellites that created overlapping fields of fire. Any attack on Earth itself would require a fleet several times larger than what the Council could currently commit, and losses would be catastrophic. Intelligence suggested that humans had been preparing for exactly this scenario and had designed their defenses specifically to make invasion too costly to attempt. But the Admiral saved his most important point for last. He explained that attacking Earth would not solve the Council's problems. Destroying human infrastructure would not restore the trade networks. Blockading their system would not bring back the technicians and engineers. Military force might satisfy a desire for revenge, but it would not fix broken equipment or feed hungry populations or restart the shipyards. He stated clearly that in his professional military opinion, any attack on Earth would be a strategic disaster that would weaken the Council far more than it would hurt humanity. The humans had positioned themselves perfectly. They were too valuable to destroy and too strong to intimidate. Counselor Zaraneth spoke up from her seat with her skin showing the deep purple of serious concern. She pointed out that the Council was facing something unprecedented in its long history. For thousands of years, the Council had been the dominant power in known space. Species joined because they had no real alternative. The Council provided stability and protection and access to established trade networks. But humans had demonstrated that alternatives were possible. She revealed information that sent a new wave of shock through the chamber. Intelligence reports indicated that Earth had been making contact with several non-Council species over the past year. At least 3 smaller civilizations had signed trade agreements with humanity in the past 2 weeks. 2 more were in active negotiations. These were species that had deliberately stayed independent of the Council, and now they were forming their own network with Earth at its center. The implications were staggering. Earth was not isolating itself as the Council had assumed. Instead, humanity was building an alternative power structure that operated completely outside Council control. If this continued, the Council might find itself competing with a human-led alliance for influence and resources. Trevicor added more details from his analysis station. The species working with Earth were small but strategically located. They controlled resources that the Council had always been able to access through indirect pressure. Now those resources would flow through human trade networks instead. Furthermore, these species were sharing technology and information with Earth in ways that could rapidly accelerate human development. One counselor asked what Earth was offering these species that made the risk worthwhile. Trevcore explained that humans were providing fair trade terms with no political strings attached. No requirements to join a government body, no demands for military integration, no insistence on cultural changes. Just honest commerce between independent peoples who treated each other as equals. It was exactly the kind of relationship that many species had wanted from the Council, but had never received. The Council had always required submission along with cooperation. Earth was offering partnership without dominance. For smaller civilizations that valued their independence, the choice was obvious. Quellon's crystalline form had settled into a dark gray that indicated defeat and acceptance. His mental voice was subdued as he addressed the chamber. He said that the Council needed to face reality. Earth was not coming back under the old terms. The humans had proven they could survive without the Council and were actively building alternatives. Meanwhile, the Council was struggling to function without human support. He stated that it was time to stop making demands and start making requests. The Council needed to approach Earth not as rulers addressing a subordinate, but as potential partners seeking an agreement. That meant accepting human sovereignty completely. It meant offering fair terms instead of ultimatums. It meant recognizing that the galaxy had changed and the Council had to change with it. Vexthar clicked angrily and accused Quellon of cowardice. He said that surrendering to human demands would destroy the Council's authority and encourage other species to challenge their power. Several counselors murmured agreement, but their voices lacked conviction. Zaraneth responded with her skin flashing a sharp red that indicated anger. She said that the Council's authority was already destroyed. They had revealed their dependence on a species they had tried to control. Every member world had watched Earth walk away and seen the panic that followed. The illusion of invincibility was shattered. Now the only question was whether they would adapt to the new reality or cling to the old ways until everything collapsed. She pointed out that other species were already taking notice. Several member worlds had quietly approached their diplomatic staff, asking about the procedures for voluntary withdrawal. They had not made any formal requests yet, but the questions alone were significant. If the Council tried to use force against Earth and failed, those questions would become demands. Quellon called for a vote on whether to contact Earth and request new negotiations. The tally was not unanimous, but the majority was clear. The Council would reach out to Ambassador Daniel Hayes and ask him to return for discussions. They would make it clear that the previous demands were no longer on the table, and that the Council was prepared to negotiate as equals. The decision to send the message took only a few hours. Actually getting a response from Earth took much longer. For 2 weeks, the Council's communications went unanswered. Human ships continued their withdrawal from Council space with mechanical efficiency. Trade remained suspended. The defense stations on the junction route stayed locked down. It was as though humanity had simply decided the Council no longer existed and was moving on without them. The silence was more unsettling than any threat. It suggested that Earth did not particularly care whether the Council survived or not. Humans had their own plans and their own alliances, and they were perfectly content to let the Council sort out its problems alone. Finally, after 16 days, a response arrived. It was brief and professional. Ambassador Hayes would return to the Council station in 1 week for preliminary discussions. He would listen to whatever proposals the Council wished to present. Earth made no promises about the outcome and reserved the right to walk away again if the terms were not acceptable. The message included one additional line that made several counselors uncomfortable. Hayes would be accompanied by representatives from 3 of the non-Council species that had signed trade agreements with Earth. They would observe the negotiations and report back to their own governments. The implication was clear. Earth was not negotiating just for itself anymore. It was representing a new coalition of independent species. Quellon read the message 3 times before accepting what it meant. The Council was no longer in a position to dictate terms or set conditions. They would present their proposals and hope that Earth found them acceptable. The balance of power had shifted completely, and everyone knew it. Corveth surprised many by expressing approval of the situation. He said that the council had grown lazy and arrogant over centuries of unchallenged authority. They had forgotten that power had to be earned and maintained. Earth had reminded them of that lesson in the most effective way possible. Now they had a chance to rebuild on a better foundation if they were smart enough to take it. Preparations began for Hayes's return visit. The council drafted new proposals that acknowledged human sovereignty and offered fair trade terms. They discussed reforms that would make membership more voluntary and less coercive. They even considered changing the council's name to something that suggested alliance rather than authority. It was humbling work for beings who had considered themselves the rulers of the galaxy. But the alternative was watching their entire civilization slowly fall apart, while humans built something new in its place. When presented with that choice, even the most prideful counselor had to admit that pride was not worth the price of survival. The week passed slowly as the council waited for Earth's ambassador to arrive and tell them whether their proposals would be enough to bring humanity back to the table. The uncertainty was difficult for species that had grown accustomed to control, but it was a lesson they needed to learn. In the new galaxy that was emerging, no one species would dominate and all would prosper through cooperation rather than coercion. Ambassador Daniel Hayes returned to the council station exactly 6 weeks after he had walked out of their chamber. The difference this time was obvious from the moment his shuttle docked. Instead of the formal reception with guards and ceremonial displays, he was met by a single aide who escorted him quietly through corridors that seemed emptier than before. The station itself looked the same, but there was a tension in the air that had not been there during his previous visits. Aliens who passed him in the hallways looked away quickly or studied him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something that might have been fear. The negotiation room was much smaller than the Grand Council chamber. It was an intimate space with a simple round table and chairs designed to accommodate various body types. High Arbiter Quillan was already there waiting along with Counselor Zaraneth and 3 other representatives from major council factions. There were no crowds of observers and no recording devices visible. This was meant to be a private conversation between people who needed to reach an understanding quickly. Daniel took his seat across from Quillan and waited. The crystalline being had lost much of the commanding presence that had made him seem so intimidating during their previous meetings. His form was a muted blue color that indicated resignation or acceptance. When he spoke, his mental voice was quieter and lacked the overwhelming authority he had used before. Quillan asked the question that Daniel had been expecting. He wanted to know what it would take for Earth to resume trade and cooperation with the Council. There were no threats or demands in his tone, no suggestions that humanity had obligations or responsibilities, just a simple question asked by someone who genuinely needed to know the answer. Daniel leaned back in his chair and studied the aliens across from him. These were the same beings who had spent 3 years telling him what humanity must do and what limits must be accepted. Now they sat in front of him waiting to hear his terms. The shift in power was complete and everyone in the room understood it. He started with the first requirement. Earth demanded full recognition of human sovereignty with no exceptions. The Council would have no authority over human military forces, no oversight of Earth's internal affairs, and no ability to interfere in how humanity chose to govern itself or defend itself. Humans would participate in Council activities only as completely independent, equals who could walk away at any time. Quillan's form flickered briefly, but he simply said the word that Daniel needed to hear. Agreed. There was no debate or attempt to negotiate modifications. The Council was accepting Earth's terms exactly as stated. Daniel continued with the second requirement. Trade between Earth and Council worlds would resume only under fair agreements negotiated between equals. Humans would set their own prices and terms. There would be no quotas or mandatory sales. Earth would trade what it wanted to trade when it wanted to trade it. The Council could buy human goods and services, or they could find alternative suppliers, but they could not demand or command. Zaraneth responded, this time with her skin shifting to a pale green that indicated careful consideration. She said the terms were reasonable and that the Council accepted them. She added that several member worlds were desperate for the resumption of trade and would agree to almost any fair terms if it meant getting access to human agriculture and technology again. Daniel, nodded and then stated his third requirement with a tone that made it clear this was the most important one. Any species that wanted to leave the Council's authority would receive the same option that Earth had taken. No retaliation, no economic punishment, no military pressure. The Council would govern by the consent of its members rather than by coercion or force. Those who wished to stay would do so because they chose to, and those who wished to leave would be free to go. The room fell into silence. This demand went far beyond Earth's relationship with the Council. It challenged the fundamental structure of galactic governance that had existed for thousands of years. Daniel watched as the Council representatives exchanged glances and silent communications that he could not intercept. Finally, Krellon spoke again. His mental voice carried a weight of historical significance as he acknowledged what this change would mean. The existing order would be dismantled and rebuilt into something new. The Council would transform from a ruling authority into something more like a voluntary alliance. Species would need to be convinced to participate rather than compelled to obey. Daniel responded that this was exactly what Earth was asking for. He said that humans would work with the Council as partners but never as subjects. The galaxy could have an organization built on mutual respect and shared interests, or it could have continued conflict and instability. The choice belonged to the Council members sitting in front of him. The deliberations took 3 full days. Daniel waited patiently in his quarters on the station, while the Council representatives debated among themselves. He received regular updates from Commander Lisa Grant, who had remained with the main human fleet. She reported that several smaller species had been watching the negotiations closely and were prepared to follow Earth's lead if the Council rejected the terms. The implications were clear. If the Council refused, they would not just lose Earth but potentially a dozen other members as well. On the morning of the 4th day, Quillon summoned Daniel back to the negotiation room. The crystalline being looked dimmer than before, as though the discussions had drained something essential from him. He announced that the Council had accepted all of Earth's terms without modification. The agreement would be formalized within the week and transmitted to all member species. The Galactic Council would become the Galactic Alliance and membership would be voluntary from this moment forward. Daniel felt tension leave his shoulders that he had been carrying for years. He had known Earth's position was strong, but there had always been the possibility that the Council would choose confrontation over compromise. Now that choice had been made and the galaxy would change because of it. As he prepared to leave the station, a young Zentari analyst named Trev Kor approached him in one of the corridors. The alien asked if he could speak privately for a moment, and Daniel agreed. They moved to an observation window that looked out at the stars and the ships moving through space around the station. Trev Kor asked Daniel if Earth had known the Council would panic when the humans walked out. His voice carried genuine curiosity rather than accusation. He seemed to be someone who wanted to understand the strategy behind what had happened. Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. He said that humanity had done the calculations and understood the economic realities. Earth knew that the Council had become dependent on human industry and trade. The analyst had run the numbers and concluded that walking away would cause significant disruption. So yes, they had known there would be a strong reaction. Trevkor pressed further. He asked what would have happened if the Council had chosen to attack instead of negotiating. What if they had called what they assumed was a bluff and sent their fleets against Earth? Daniel's expression hardened and his voice took on an edge that had not been there before. He explained that it would not have been a bluff. Humans had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of warfare. They had come to space hoping they could finally leave that violent history behind. They had tried diplomacy and cooperation and peaceful coexistence. But they had never forgotten how to fight, and they had never stopped preparing for the possibility that they might need to defend themselves against superior numbers. He told Trevakor that Earth's defense systems were designed by people who had studied every major conflict in human history. They incorporated lessons learned from countless wars and battles and sieges. Human military doctrine assumed that any enemy would be larger and better equipped, so it focused on making victory as costly as possible. Every defense station, every ship, every weapon system was built with the understanding that humans might someday need to fight for their survival against impossible odds. Trevkor listened in silence as Daniel continued. The ambassador explained that the Council had made a wise choice today by accepting partnership over domination. They had chosen to build a new kind of relationship based on mutual respect, rather than trying to enforce obedience through force. That choice would benefit everyone involved, but if they had made the other choice, if they had decided to punish Earth for its defiance, they would have learned a hard lesson about humanity. They would have discovered that humans did not surrender easily and did not break under pressure. They would have found out that threatening people who had survived ice ages and plagues and world wars was a very different thing than threatening species that had lived in peace for centuries. Daniel paused and looked directly at the young analyst. He said that humans did not do well with masters. Their entire history was a story of rebellion against authority and rejection of control. Every empire that had tried to dominate them had eventually fallen. Every tyrant who had tried to rule them had ultimately failed. It was simply part of what made humans human. Trevor nodded slowly as though something he had suspected was now confirmed. He thanked Daniel for his honesty and then asked one final question. He wanted to know what would happen now that the Council was becoming the Alliance. Daniel smiled for the first time since returning to the station. He said that the galaxy would learn to work together properly. Species would cooperate because it benefited them, rather than because they were forced to. Trade would flow more freely. Innovation would accelerate. The smaller civilizations that had been ignored would finally have a voice. And humanity would be there as a partner and ally to anyone who approached them with respect. He added that Earth had no desire to replace the Council as some new dominant power. Humans had not fought for their independence just to turn around and rule over others. They simply wanted to be left alone to live their lives and build their future on their own terms. Anyone who accepted that would find humans to be loyal friends and valuable partners. As Daniel's shuttle departed from the station and began the journey back to Earth, he watched the Council facility recede into the distance. Somewhere in that massive structure, representatives from hundreds of species were coming to terms with a new reality. The age of enforced unity was ending and something new was beginning. The message would spread quickly through the galaxy. Earth had stood up to the Council and won, not through military force or threats, but through the simple act of walking away. Humanity had reminded everyone of a truth that powerful organizations often forgot. Authority without consent was just another word for tyranny, and free people would always resist tyranny no matter what form it took. The Galactic Alliance would be different from what came before. It would be better, and at its heart would be the species that had shown everyone else that independence was worth fighting for, and that respect had to be earned rather than demanded.